Good morning, everyone. I want to touch on, as the title of my talk this morning indicates, lessons that can be learned from one of the more problematic verses in the Bible. I'll come to that in a moment. But just as a backdrop, the name Genesis, of which many of us are aware, is derived from the Greek translation of the Bible, which is referred to as the Septuagint. There are multiple translations of the Bible, certainly by now, but also in antiquity. There is the Vulgate, there was the Targum Onkelos, Latin translations, that was a little bit later, but Aramaic translation that was considerably earlier. And the simple reason why the Bible was translated is to make it accessible. It has little value if you can't understand what it is that you're reading. So the word Genesis comes from the Greek translation. And not uncommon, the Greek translation of the biblical works centered around what the translators thought was the salient message, or perhaps the thesis of the book, hence the creation of the world, Genesis. In Hebrew, the names of the books typically take on what is a salient word in the opening sentence of the book itself. Sometimes it's the namesake of the author in the case of the prophets. So in Hebrew, it's Bereshit, in the beginning, or the beginning of God's creation of the world. No thematic connection, simply what is the salient word. If I were to name the book of Genesis, I would name it family. But family with all of its imperfections. I would name it family because as you peel through the book of Genesis, it portrays the family with all of its real tensions, with all of its discord, with all of its struggle, things that you and I, reverse that, you and I, you didn't catch that. All right, anyway, I'm trying to make what is a problematic section of the Bible a little bit more palatable. In any event, things that we can relate to, things that we live, things that we're responsible in bringing about within the discord as well as the harmony within the confines of our own family. I want to look at the verses, as you are aware, as part of a series that you've been studying, and I'd like to begin by examining a few verses and offer a synthesis towards the end of my remarks. So if we could take a look at verses 1 through 4 in Genesis chapter 37, please. We're talking about family here. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph was a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Actually, the verse that I do want to focus in on is verse 3. So, there we go. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. This is the ma'il pasim, the coat that is striped, or popularly referred to as the coat of many colors. In Hebrew, it's pasim, of stripes. To my point, that I would name the book of Genesis family, this is such a peculiar verse from the gate. This is problematic from the simple standpoint that Jacob is showing overt favoritism to a child. Those of us who are blessed with children or are involved perhaps in nieces and nephews' lives or are aware of and close to our friends' children, we can understand as adults that each child has strengths and perhaps deficits. It's not an accountant's measure of the value of a human being, but we just know that. Children excel in X where other children perhaps are not as interested or as adroit. We understand that. But this, from the gate, talk about family dynamic, overt favoritism. But what makes things worse here, and this is even more problematic, the reason for his favoritism, it has nothing to do with Joseph's goodness, his courage, his kind, helpful attitude, but he's the child of his old age. How superficial can you get? On top of which, it covers up what is probably the real reason. He's the son of Rachel, and Jacob loves Rachel. Jacob favored Rachel over Leah. It's a real portrayal. We can look at this and say, how disgusting. It is disgusting. But it's as if the biblical text is a shining amber light. Caution, navigate with care. The family is inseparable to who we are, but it is filled with potholes, all kinds of troubles, because it's constructed with human beings. So there's no mention of Rachel, and on top of which, he favored Joseph. Jacob favored Joseph because of his old age. That's not true. It's not even accurate. Benjamin is the child of his old age, not Joseph. So that from the gate, we're already perhaps not at the edge of our seat as much as called to pay more exact attention. So what ends up happening as the narrative continues? Joseph is sent to check up on his brothers who loathe him, and understandably so. This idea of sibling rivalry is rarely siblings against siblings. It's the individual child crying out to his or her mother or father, take note of who I am. Look how special I am. Because that is part of the formula of years of all of us, how we develop and how we are taught and molded into being a more altruistic and decent human being. I've always said the goal of parents is never to raise children, it's to raise adults. So Joseph is sent by his father to check up on his brothers in the flocks. And here, if we can read on, if we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. Forgive me. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. And the Hebrew word is hineni. I'm ready, Dad. I'm poised. I'm ready to follow your dictate. If we could get the next slide, please. It is. All right, so the next one, please. Forgive me. So he goes out, that is, Joseph goes out, and this is a curious piece of text by itself. A man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? Almost like a Hemingway novel, out of nowhere. Is this person a messenger? Is this part of a grand design orchestrated by the Holy One, by God? I'll leave you to your own devices. He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? Next slide, please. They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Datan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Datan. And this is interesting also, because modern scholarship holds that Datan is a city, not a place of pasture. Why is this particularly important? Perhaps, this is speculative, that Joseph discovers his brothers and that they were neglecting the flocks of their father. And what were they doing? They were exploring the pleasures of the city with all the innuendo intended. Sounds funny, but it's real. Again, we're not talking about these anodized figures of the past. We're talking about human beings with the same urges, the same strength, the same weakness that I, you, all of us have within us. To hide their embarrassment that the brothers were not doing their job as instructed by their father, on top of this immense enmity that they felt for their brother, they wanted to get rid of him. They literally wanted to kill Joseph. So they conspired to do just that. The firstborn brother, Reuben, intercedes, and in the process, they strip Joseph of his ma'il pasim, his striped tunic, his striped coat, just to add further indignity, to just voice even greater hatred and antipathy towards their brother. So this is where I want to focus in on lessons learned from one of the more problematic verses in the Bible, to be faithful to the title of my sermon this morning. Let's look at verse 24, please, if that can come up. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and they threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. In Hebrew, it's a bore. And in all likelihood, these were dug or they were natural pits that were quite deep. And they would store water, but in this case, as the Bible indicates, the cistern is empty. There is an 11th century biblical commentator and legalist by the name of Rashi, and he makes the point, no water was in this pit, but there were scorpions and snakes. And you can imagine, again, let's not sugarcoat any of this, just how gruesome this is and how real. I've always wondered why I've heard, not on great occasion, but nonetheless still hear, of the irrelevance of the Bible. I'm not grandstanding when I say to you, I can't think of a more relevant text. The orientation, the cultural amenities, of course, have changed. Time has changed, but the fabric of human beings remain the same. And it's not a psychology text, and it's not a history text, and it's not an archaeological text. It is a moral guide. These flashing amber lights. Navigate carefully. So they throw him in the pit, and this is the verse. This is the verse that should just grab all of us, and metaphorically shake us. And something that we've read perhaps umpteen times and just passed over it and not thought about it. But let's read on. They threw him in the cistern was empty, and what do? They sat down to eat their meal. Could you imagine? Within an earshot of invariably, and I'm not grandstanding here, I don't think this is unrealistic speculation. Within an earshot of hearing their brother scream out, "Oh, can you pass the ketchup?" Wow, the hummus and the olive oil are fresh today. And here, in a less than subtle way, the biblical text, the most relevant of all texts, I actually believe that, is saying all of us, doesn't matter, Jew, Christian, Muslim, atheist, whomever, whatever, take this to heart. how indifferent we can become. And in part, it's understandable. Life is complex, the pressures, the diversions. And not to use the excuse, I'm only human. The hope is that we ascend to holiness. But I'm only human, and therefore I have intrinsic limitations. Yes, it's true. I was taught when I was a student, never eat dinner while you're watching the local news or the national news. Never do it. Never do it. Because it will make you insensitive. We watch the most horrific things, hear of the most horrific things, experience some of the most horrific things. Pass the ketchup. And I'm not here to browbeat. I'm not. As I look out to you and speak to you, this speaks to me. How many times I've walked by someone who's just lying on the sidewalk. And I have very, very strong and opinionated views with regard to homelessness. Because these are human beings of every equal measure, made in God's image as every human being, born or yet to be born. But how indifferent we can become. And as we say in Hebrew, yesh gvul, there are limitations. Here I wouldn't say, I'm only human, therefore give me a pass, but I would say, I am so beyond far, infinitely far from being God. That's another story. So what ends up happening? Judah intercedes and proposes that his brothers sell Joseph into slavery, and then they leave him in a pit. And then here the Hebrew also, they sell Joseph for esrim shekel, for 20 pieces of silver. How more disgusting can this story devolve into? How real it is. The hatred, the enmity, the complete objectification of a human being, not being able to see or understand the family dynamic, let alone one's own impulses. The greatest challenge all of us face, is with ourselves. But Judah intercedes, and just as an aside, Judah is arguably my favorite character in the Bible, because he's so flawed, but because he's so decent at the same time. That's for another encounter. So Joseph is eventually sold into slavery. And what do we learn from that? Any number of things. One of which, that is how the Exodus story begins. It doesn't begin because of famine. It doesn't begin because of drought. It doesn't begin because the brothers of Jacob want to take a cruise on the Nile. It begins out of hatred within the confines of a family. Families that to varying degree are not different from mine and from yours. That amber light flashing. Caution, you need this, but be careful. That's how the Exodus begins. And we can take away from this something concrete. These are the children of Jacob. We are the children of God. I'm not saying this to offer platitudes. All of us are brothers and sisters. I actually believe that. All of us are made B'Tselem Elohim in God's image. All of us are the children of our Creator, and I'm not talking about our biological parents. And it starts here in a holy place such as this beautiful church. The discord, the disparity. I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican. I have a variant lifestyle. I'm a Christian, I'm a Jew, I'm a Muslim. Good. Wonderful. But you're also my brother and my sister. And I want to learn. I want to learn from the very book that I at least believe came from our Creator, that bonds us inseparably together. So next time you pass the ketchup, think about this little section of text, and with it, how the Exodus actually did begin, and how you and I and all of us are brothers and sisters on God's blessed earth. Thank you very much.